So yesterday I had to end the recording quite abruptly because my parents got up and it was time to start looking after them. But there were still some other things I wanted to say about this topic on the differences between meditating on a conceptual object and meditating on something that arises to your direct perception or the subjective awareness. Now, as I said many times before, there are these three stages in spiritual development, and that is understanding, experience, and realization. But these three are not abstract concepts. They're something that we do in any form of education or when we develop new skills. And so I'd like to give you a simple worldly example of how this process works. Whatever new skill you wish to develop, then first you have to learn the basic principles. And then once you've learned the basic principles, you're able to put them into practice and develop some experience in the job at hand. Based on developing some experience, then it is possible to become an expert in that field. But it is not certain that everyone will become an expert in the particular field of study. So to give you an example from my own life, then when I was young, I was very interested in sailing boats, but I came from a place that had no ocean or lakes, and so I was completely ignorant about sailing. My family didn't have a boat. We weren't sailing people. I never got the opportunity to learn how to sail. At some point when I got older, then I moved near the ocean, and having access to the sea, then the thought arose that wouldn't it be nice to learn how to sail. But I was completely ignorant about sailing. I didn't understand even the basic principles. And so the first thing I did was download a PDF that explained the fundamentals of sailing. After I read that and I felt that I understood how a sailboat worked and how to sail, then I went out onto the ocean and tried it out for myself. So at first, you really aren't able to do the task at hand. It's something new to you, it's unfamiliar, and you're awkward. And even though you understand the basic principles, then it's very difficult to do. Now, the best way to do this is to seek the advice of a teacher, because when you have a teacher, they can show you how things work, and then that way you can gain some personal experience. Well, in my case, then I didn't have a teacher, and so it was more or less trial or error. But at some point, I was able to make a starboard tack. And so once that happens, you have a kind of personal experience of how to take a boat to starboard and how that boat will move against the ocean and the wind. And that becomes a very kind of visceral and personal experience. But just having that simple experience of one maneuver on a boat doesn't make you a sailor. And you have to repeat your experiments time and time again until you develop some skill. And it's on the basis of developing these kind of skills that eventually you become confident. You become a confident sailor, or you become confident in whatever skill that you're developing. So initially, when I was learning how to sail, then there were some things I didn't understand. And one was how two boats could move in opposite directions with the same wind. It didn't make sense. In fact, I was so ignorant about sailing, I hadn't even thought about this point. It was kind of new to me. So the person who wrote the PDF had given a simple analogy. And what he said was, you imagine it's like a watermelon seed squeezed between your fingertips. And when you squeeze it, it kind of shoots off in a particular direction. And I found that very helpful. It was very helpful to understand how it is that a boat can move against the wind or into the wind. And so for many religious traditions, it's the same. We're given these kind of conceptual ideas, we're given logical arguments to help us to understand a concept or an idea. And this is what I was talking about yesterday, is this path of vast learning. And you do this, you deal with concepts and ideas in order to bring your understanding closer to the truth. And it's necessary, right? It's necessary with any form of education. And Buddhists use this as well. There's nothing wrong with that. In general, then religion tends to present something that is a matter of doctrine. So they'll present a position, and then they use these kind of logical tricks or clever ideas to convince you that something exists. For example, you could state that all thought arises out of the collective unconscious. And I could say, well, I've never seen such a thing as a collective unconscious. How do I know it exists? And the teacher might say, well, you don't see your own eyes, right? That doesn't mean your eyes don't exist. Now, this is a kind of mind game, really. It's a way of trying to convince people of something that they don't believe in. And to a greater or lesser degree, depending on that individual's kind of blind faith, then they can be brought to believe something that they didn't initially believe, or believe in something that they can't perceive or experience. Buddhism uses these kind of arguments as well, but something you should know is that we spend almost as much time with the counter-arguments. We spend a lot of time with arguments that disprove our position, and not only that, but within Buddhism there's many, many different schools, and they disagree on many issues. So this is quite normal to use these kind of concepts and analogies. But for example, this analogy of you don't see your own eyes, therefore you can't say that the eyes don't exist, could be applied to anything. For example, I had a friend who believed that the US government was run by alien space lizards. So I could say, well, I've never seen an alien space lizard. What are you talking about? Well, you can't see your own eyes, right? That doesn't mean your eyes don't exist. So you can use it for anything, really. There has to be something behind that. So let's just take something that's a bit less silly as an example. The Buddha taught that there are the Four Noble Truths. And you could say, well, how do I know that there are these Four Noble Truths, you know? I've never seen them. And what is the first truth? The first truth is the truth of suffering. So you say, well, the first truth is suffering. And you have suffering, don't you? And the person can identify with that experience of suffering. They are aware that they suffer. And then they might ask, well, yes, there is the truth of suffering. I have experienced suffering. It does exist. It's something real. And then the next question that the Buddha asked is, well, where does this suffering come from? And now the standard answer that we give, being immature beings, is that it was because of something external. For example, my husband said something nasty to me, and that made me suffer. Or I ate some Indian food today, and it was very spicy, and my mouth is burning. Therefore, this Indian food made me suffer. So in general, then, we have this idea that it's external things that make us suffer. So the next question to ask is that, well, if this Indian food causes suffering because it's spicy, then it should cause suffering for everyone. But it is the case that somebody who likes spicy food will experience pleasure and not suffering when they eat chili. It's only because you don't like chili that you are suffering from having eaten spicy food. And so in this way, you can demonstrate or show that this kind of idea, that this external thing has caused my suffering, is particular to the sense of an individual and their preferences, their likes, etc., or their disposition. So anyway, that's just an example. So there's a difference between that and meditating on something that arises to direct perception. That's the main point here. It's not about the different techniques and systems that get used in order to guide one closer to the truth. Now, let's just give a real-life example, something I heard Rupet Spira talk about. He said, you can say, I am aware of the flower. I am aware of the flower. And then take away this idea of the flower, and what you're left with is, I am aware. And that's your meditation. Okay, that's not a real thing that arises to your direct perception that you're meditating on there. That is meditating on a concept, right? It's a concept that's been developed using one of these kind of logical arguments or these conceptual ideas, like I am aware of a flower, remove a flower, I am aware. So this I am aware becomes a truth, and it becomes an idea or concept that we meditate on. In fact, I was watching a video the other day of Rupet Spira, and he was asked where thoughts come from, and his answer is where everything comes from. Everything comes from the universal consciousness. So this idea of a universal consciousness is something that we're expected to accept. And there are various different ways that we can try to get somebody to accept this, but there is no way that we can actually prove the existence of, let's say, a universal consciousness or a God, etc. Now, whether or not these things exist is not the question. I'm not trying to refute the existence of universal consciousness or say that God doesn't exist. That's not my point. That is not the point of these videos. The point is that there is a difference between meditating on a concept or idea that is something that we are expected to believe, and meditating on direct perception or direct awareness. And my question to you is, what harm is there in trying it out? It will not erode your belief systems in any way, and it will only sort of add more colors to your palette. It will only broaden your skill set in the spiritual path. Why would we want to meditate on these visceral experiences that arise to mind? The theory is, if there is a true nature of phenomena, then that true nature must exist within all phenomena. Now, you don't have to accept that there is such a thing as a true nature of all phenomena. There's no proof that such a thing exists. But if it does exist, then it must exist within all phenomena, whether that be external objects, thoughts, ideas, etc. This must exist. And so our goal in meditating on direct perception is to come to understand this nature of all phenomena. Because if it's present within that, then there must be some way, or there may be some way in which we can detect that. Now, the reason why we don't focus on external objects so much, like if there's a vase or something in front of me full of flowers, and I meditate on that, then that vase must also contain the true nature of all phenomena. But the problem here is that we have a very strong clinging to outer objects. For example, if I were to throw something at you, then you would instinctively dodge out of the way. We have a very, very strong clinging to the reality of these things. And so we tend to use things like thoughts and feelings, things that arise to mind. And now, do we know that these things exist? Well, in general, when you talk to people about meditation, they will say things like, I couldn't meditate today because there were too many thoughts. Or, why are you upset? Because I thought you were being unkind to me. So we have these thoughts that arise in meditation, in our daily life. Then we are sort of acutely aware of our thoughts, and we see them to be real. So if they exist, and that means that we are able to investigate their nature and in what way they exist. Now, I'll give you kind of a more simple example here. This question that came up in Rupet Spira's video was, well, where do thoughts come from? The woman asked. And this is a very common question, right? You often hear this in question and answer sessions in spiritual teaching. So we have this basic assumption that thoughts arise or come from somewhere. So what harm is there in looking into this question? What harm is there into looking into it for yourself? The woman asked, where do thoughts come from? Now, Rupet Spira's answer was, where everything comes from. They come from the collective unconscious. This is the most common way of teaching meditation, is that the teacher will tell you how it is and expect you to believe that. And then they'll give reasons to back it up. For example, where do thoughts come from? They arise from the universal consciousness. And then you could say, well, I've never seen the universal consciousness. Well, you've never seen your own eyes, have you? Doesn't mean they don't exist. So it's a way of kind of coercing somebody or convincing them of something that they haven't perceived, convincing them that it exists. Is this a mistaken way of teaching? Well, not necessarily. I mean, it's quite useful. The point I'm trying to make here is that if it is the case that thoughts arise from a particular place, then why is it that you have to tell somebody where they arise from? How is it we know that thoughts arise? And how do we know that they arise from somewhere? So we have this basic assumption that they do, right? We assume that thoughts arise from somewhere. So where do they come from? So why don't you just look into thought itself? Instead of relying on the statements of others, what's wrong with looking into it for yourself? Sit in meditation, and when a thought arises, have a look and see where it came from. Why do you need to ask the teacher, is my point. You have thoughts, right? You think all day long. When you meditate, they get in the way of your meditation. So if you've got all these thoughts and they're causing you a problem, so logically you should be able to see where they're coming from, if they're coming from somewhere, right? Otherwise, then if you have to ask somebody else and rely on their statements as a matter of faith, of blind faith, let's say, then it's a bit strange, right? Because it's your mind, it's your subjective awareness. I mean, Rupet Spira can't see what's going on in your mind, so how does he know? So then it's on the basis of this that we can come to some direct experience. It's just like the analogy of learning how to sail. It's actually by doing it, putting it into practice, that you gain some real experience. And it's these real experiences that accumulate and lead to one becoming sort of professional or an expert. There's a slight difference here with this kind of analogy, and that's because people don't really realize sailing, for example. They become very good at it, or they can become experts, and most people will never become an expert. but they can't really realize it, because realization is a stable and unchanging state. So it's as if you became a sailor where the sailing was always perfect and never went wrong. But we can't do that because we can't control the circumstances of our sailing. There can be a storm, or you could hit a rock. And so even the best sailors have bad days. So they never really achieve this state of realization. And this just goes to show how difficult realization is. Somebody who has realization then has kind of perfected their meditation to the point where their experience of the true nature of reality is stable and unchanging day and night, whether they're meditating or not. So it's incredibly difficult. And so it's kind of laughable when people claim to have awakened, because awakening is a state of realization of the true nature of phenomena. It's not just a mere conceptual understanding of an idea, like understanding emptiness, for example. It's a development of experience within that meditation until it becomes so stable that it's constant day and night, in dreams and sleeping at any time. I hope this has been helpful for you to understand where I'm coming from. When I say I'm putting forward my position, what does that mean when you say I'm sort of expressing my position? It means I'm trying to let you understand where I'm coming from, how I see things. It doesn't mean I want you to accept my beliefs. For example, I'm not telling you where your thoughts come from. And I'm not telling you what the true nature of phenomena is. That's what most teachers do, especially these days on YouTube. Their students ask a question, and then they say, well, all thought comes from the collective unconsciousness, and this is the reasons why you have to believe this. Well, there's a difference between that and this path of direct perception. And this path of direct perception is a path where the individual comes to personal experience about these matters and gains this sort of personal knowledge, personal spiritual knowledge. And that is what I'm encouraging you to do. I'm encouraging you to investigate for yourself. As the Buddha said, do not accept out of mere respect and reverence, but analyze as a goldsmith analyzes gold by cutting, rubbing, and burning it to see whether it is authentic or not. And that, to me, really is the main instruction for anything, for science, spirituality, for whatever you do. Of course, you have to rely on teachers. Not relying on a teacher is a mistake. Because it's very proud to assume that you can sort of grasp something all by yourself. You do need to rely on teachers. You need to seek out people who you feel have spiritual knowledge and rely on them. Because it would be foolish for every new skill that you wanted to learn to kind of start from the scratch and try to reinvent the whole process, If you wanted to learn how to light a barbecue, then you'd have to rediscover fire. It'd be kind of difficult, wouldn't it? So you do need to rely on prior knowledge and received wisdom. And then once you have that, then more importantly, you need to develop your own personal experience and not just accept the trite statements of others. And most religious systems are based on this. They're based on having blind faith and acceptance of the statements of others, and also about becoming part of a community. We've got this very strong herd mentality. So if we get into a spiritual community, it's very easy to get carried away by the power of the group. And to me, that's quite a negative thing. You lose your independence. And it's a danger in all religious traditions. It's also a danger in Buddhism. Many people just fall into the herd mentality of the Buddhist religion, as they do with Christianity, Muslim, or whatever it is. But I don't see that as being so useful to you. And again, who am I talking to? I'm talking to these kind of diligent and sincere individuals who want to get to the bottom of things. Because for some people, quite frankly, it's much better for them just to join the herd, because they haven't really got the potential for anything phenomenal, to become experts, to become learned. They'll only ever be followers. For them, then it's probably better to follow the herd. But they have to find a good herd, right? They need to follow good people. You don't want to get wrapped up into some kind of really negative cult and just go along with that. That will never help you in any way whatsoever. You have to find good and decent people and try to be like them. And in that way, then you can have a positive influence on society and the world in general. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'll see you again next time.